In the town of Fairpoint, a retired soldier finds himself forced into battle once again when a ruthless biker gang sets their sights on his home. As the violence escalates, he gathers a small group of fighters, former soldiers, lawmen and townspeople willing to stand their ground. Against overwhelming odds, they defend their town, sacrificing everything to keep it safe. But war doesn't end with a single battle. When the dust settles and the streets are quiet once more, Frank Holloway must make a choice: stay and rebuild, or take the fight to the next town before another enemy rises. The road ahead is uncertain, and the war is far from over. But one thing is clear: some warriors never stop fighting. Will Frank Holloway ever find peace, or is he destined to walk the road of war until the end? Hold on a moment before we move forward. Let us know where in the world you're watching from, and if you're loving these stories, don't forget to hit subscribe. Tomorrow's episode is going to be absolutely mind-blowing. Frank Holloway never asked for recognition. He never sought out admiration or sympathy. He had spent years trying to leave the past behind, but war had a way of keeping its claws in a man, sinking deep into his bones, settling in his soul like an unwelcome tenant that refused to leave. It had been decades since Vietnam, but some nights he still woke up drenched in sweat, fists clenched, breath coming in short gasps, his heart hammering against his ribcage like it was trying to escape. And when morning came, when the sun peeked through the blinds of his small house on the edge of town, he would shake it off just like he always did. Another day, another chance to keep moving forward. The town of Fairpoint was small, the kind of place where the same people sat at the same diner booths every morning, where the local barber knew your entire family history, where everyone had a polite nod for one another. For Frank, it was enough. He lived alone, just a modest one-story house with a porch that creaked under the weight of his footsteps. The inside was simple. Old furniture that had seen better days, bookshelves lined with history and war novels, a rifle mounted above the fireplace that hadn't been fired in years. It was a quiet life, one he had earned through blood and sacrifice, and yet he still carried the weight of the past on his shoulders. His routine was simple: mornings at the Veterans Hospital, afternoons at the community center where he volunteered to teach young recruits the things their drill sergeants wouldn't, things about survival, about what really happened when you left the comfort of training grounds and stepped into the fire. Some listened, others didn't. He didn't take it personally. He knew the ones who laughed at his warnings would carry his words with them when the first bullet whistled past their heads. Then they'd understand. The people of Fairpoint saw him as an old soldier, nothing more. Some gave him nods of respect, others simply overlooked him, a relic of a past war most people wanted to forget. The younger crowd barely noticed him. To them, he was just another old man with stories they had no interest in hearing. And that was fine. He didn't need validation. He didn't need people whispering about the things he had done or the men he had lost. He just needed something to keep his hands busy, something to keep his mind from wandering to places it no longer belonged. That morning, as Frank walked through the hospital doors, he could already hear the familiar voices of the regulars, old men who had been through different wars but carried the same scars. He greeted them with firm handshakes and small nods, listening to their stories, offering what little advice he could. It wasn't much, but for some of them it was the only thing keeping them tethered to the world. "Frank!" came a voice from the hallway. It was Sarah Carter, one of the nurses. She was in her late 30s, sharp-eyed and full of fire, the kind of woman who had seen enough suffering to make her tough, but hadn't let it harden her completely. She had a soft spot for the veterans, always making sure they were treated with dignity, always making time to sit and listen. "You planning on staying all day?" she asked, leaning against the doorway with her arms crossed. "Maybe," Frank answered, his voice low and even. "Not much waiting for me at home." Sarah gave him a knowing look. "You should come by the center later. Cole's back in town." Frank paused. Cole Dawson, former Marine, younger than Frank by a good 20 years but cut from the same cloth. They had worked together before, training young recruits, helping vets find their footing after service. Frank hadn't seen him in months. "He say why?" Sarah shook her head. "Just said he wanted to talk." Frank grunted. That could mean anything. But if Cole wanted to talk, it was worth listening. The rest of the morning passed in its usual way. Conversations about old battles, quiet moments shared with men who had nothing left but memories. Frank found himself talking with a young soldier, barely out of boot camp, his hands trembling as he spoke about deployment. He saw himself in that kid, saw the fear, the uncertainty. He offered words of wisdom, the kind that only a man who had lived through hell could give. And when the kid finally left, standing a little taller, Frank felt something settle in his chest. Purpose, maybe that was all he needed. By late afternoon, he found himself standing outside the community center, watching as a few men hauled equipment inside. Cole was there, standing near the entrance, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked different, older. There was a weight in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "You look like hell," Frank said by way of greeting. Cole smirked. "And you look exactly the same. Guess we can't all age like whiskey." Frank grunted, stepping inside. The place hadn't changed much. Old training mats laid out across the floor, punching bags hanging from the ceiling, walls lined with faded photographs of men who had come through these doors before. Some of them were still around, some weren't. Cole followed him in, his expression turning serious. "I need to talk to you about something." Frank didn't reply, just gave him a look that said, "Go on." Cole exhaled. "There's been trouble." Frank's jaw tightened slightly. Trouble wasn't new, but the way Cole said it, the way his shoulders tensed, it wasn't the usual kind. "The Iron Reapers," Cole continued. "They're back, and they're not just passing through." Frank had heard the name before. A biker gang that had caused chaos in surrounding towns. They weren't just about riding motorcycles and drinking too much. They were something else, something worse. "They're targeting places with vets," Cole said. "Memorials, recruitment offices, hospitals. They vandalize, harass people, make a show of tearing down anything that stands for what we fought for." Frank felt something cold settle in his gut. He had seen plenty of men who lost their way, men who turned to crime when they had nothing else. But this was different. This was deliberate, calculated. "They've got their eyes on Fairpoint," Cole added. "I figured you should know." Frank stayed quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the training mats in front of him. He had spent years trying to live a quiet life, to stay out of the fights that no longer belonged to him. But some fights had a way of finding you, no matter how much you tried to avoid them. Finally, he looked at Cole, his voice steady. "Then I guess we'd better be ready." The first sign of trouble came in the form of tire tracks, deep, winding scars carved into the dirt roads on the outskirts of town. Still fresh from the night before, Frank Holloway spotted them while walking home from the community center, his boots crunching against gravel as he crouched down for a closer look. Wide treads, heavy weight. Motorcycles, not the usual riders from town either. The grooves told a different story. Too many of them, all coming from the same direction, leading toward Fairpoint but never quite into it, scouting, watching. Frank straightened, his jaw tightening as his gaze drifted toward the tree line beyond the road. Empty, quiet. But it wasn't the kind of quiet he liked. It was the kind that came before the first shots were fired. Something was coming. By the time he made it home, the sun had already dipped below the horizon, bleeding orange into the sky. The air smelled like rain, thick with the kind of tension that made a man's bones ache before a storm hit. His house sat at the end of a lonely stretch of road, its white paint faded, its wooden steps creaking under his weight as he climbed onto the porch. He pushed open the door, stepping inside to the familiar scent of old wood and dust. The rifle above his fireplace caught his eye. He hadn't touched it in years, hadn't needed to. Until now. The knock on his door came just as he was pouring himself a glass of whiskey. Firm, deliberate, 3 times, followed by silence. Someone who wanted to be heard, but not in a rush. Frank didn't bother reaching for his gun. If someone wanted him dead, They wouldn't knock. He opened the door to find Cole Dawson standing on the other side, a cigarette hanging from the corner of his mouth, his leather jacket damp from the rising humidity. "They're here," Cole said, not wasting a second. Frank exhaled, stepping aside to let him in. Cole entered, shaking off the damp before tossing his cigarette into the dirt outside. He smelled like motor oil and sweat, the way a man did when he'd been driving all day, chasing ghosts down highways that didn't want to be found. "They rolled in last night," Cole continued, pacing the room like a caged wolf. "Iron Reapers, at least 20 of them, maybe more. Sticking to the outskirts for now, but they're planning something." Frank leaned against the counter, his glass of whiskey untouched. "How do you know?" "Because I was there," Cole said. "Watch them set up near the old train station. They're armed, well-equipped. They aren't just here to drink and cause trouble. They're looking to tear this place apart." Frank stared at him for a long moment, his fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. He knew men like the Reapers, knew what they were capable of, and he knew what was coming. They wouldn't stop at vandalism. "You sure about this?" Frank asked, though he already knew the answer. Cole nodded. "Yeah, and there's something else." Frank waited. "They're talking about the hospital," Cole said. "They see it as a symbol, a place for old-world warriors. Their words, not mine. They think places like that keep the past alive, and they want to erase it." Frank felt something cold crawl up his spine. The hospital wasn't just a building. It was a lifeline, a place where men like him went to find peace, to be with others who understood what it meant to walk in boots stained with blood and regret. The Reapers wanted to take that away. His fingers flexed at his side. A muscle in his jaw twitched. "Sheriff know?" he asked. Cole scoffed. "Yeah, and guess what? He's not lifting a damn finger." Frank's eyes darkened. Sheriff Dwayne Leland had been a problem for years. He was the kind of man who only enforced the law when it benefited him, a politician in a badge who liked the sound of his own voice more than the weight of his own authority. If the Reapers had money, Leland would look the other way. Frank sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Damn coward." Cole nodded. "Which means if something's gonna be done, it's gotta be us." Frank's knuckles rapped against the counter, a slow, rhythmic tap as he thought. Then he grabbed his jacket. "We'll need help," Frank said, already moving toward the door. Cole smirked. "I was hoping you'd say that." The war was coming, and this time, Frank wasn't going to sit it out. Frank Holloway walked into the sheriff's office with his hands in his pockets, his shoulders relaxed, his expression unreadable. The place smelled of stale coffee and cheap cologne. A thick layer of dust settled on paperwork that hadn't been touched in weeks. Sheriff Dwayne Leland sat behind his desk, feet propped up, a half-eaten sandwich resting on a stack of unread case files. The man barely looked up when Frank entered, just took another bite and chewed loudly. "What can I do for you, Holloway?" Leland asked, finally acknowledging him with a lazy glance. Frank didn't bother sitting. He wasn't planning on staying long. "The Iron Reapers are here." Leland smirked, shaking his head. "So?" Frank's fingers twitched, but he kept his composure. "So, they're not just passing through. They're looking to make a statement, and they've got their eyes on the hospital." Leland exhaled loudly, setting his sandwich down. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand before leaning forward. "You're overreacting. I got no reports of them causing any real trouble. Maybe a few of them got a little rowdy outside Murphy's bar, but that's hardly cause for concern." Frank's jaw clenched. He wasn't in the mood for games. "They're scouting, vandalizing war memorials, gathering numbers. They're not here to party, Leland. They're here to tear this town apart." The sheriff chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Frank, you've been watching too many damn war movies. These are just some bikers trying to make noise. You're the one acting like they're an invading army." Frank took a step closer, his voice steady but firm. "I've seen men like them before. You don't stop them early, you don't stop them at all." Leland let out a slow sigh, rubbing the bridge of his nose like a man forced to deal with an annoying child. "And what do you want me to do?" Call in the National Guard. Declare martial law? Frank shook his head. I want you to do your damn job. The room went quiet. Leland's smirk faded, his eyes narrowing. Careful, Holloway. I don't take kindly to folks telling me how to run things. Frank met his stare without blinking. Yeah? Then maybe you shouldn't wear the badge. For a moment, the air felt like it might split. Then Leland laughed, a low, mocking chuckle. You don't scare me, old man. You're just another relic trying to hold on to a past that don't exist anymore. He leaned forward, his smirk returning. And I'll tell you something else. If those bikers want to piss on some forgotten statues, I ain't gonna waste my time stopping them. Frank didn't say another word. He just turned and walked out, his boots echoing against the wooden floor. He knew what was coming, and he knew Leland wasn't going to do a damn thing to stop it. The night air was thick, carrying the distant hum of engines. Frank stood outside the hospital, his hands in his pockets, watching the parking lot with sharp eyes. A few of the nurses were heading home, their chatter soft as they climbed into their cars. He spotted Sarah Carter locking up, her posture stiff, her eyes darting toward the road like she expected something to crawl out of the darkness. You should head straight home, Frank said as she approached him. Sarah stopped, looking at him with a knowing expression. They're here, aren't they? Frank nodded. Not yet, but they will be. Sarah glanced toward the trees beyond the lot, then back at him. And the sheriff? Frank exhaled through his nose. He's not gonna help. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't seem surprised. Then what do we do? Frank glanced toward the hospital, his mind already working through the possibilities. We prepare. She studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. I'll warn the staff, she said before heading back inside. Frank stayed put, watching the road, listening, and then he heard it. Engines, low and steady, rolling in from the outskirts. Not reckless, not in a hurry. Just a slow, creeping presence, like wolves testing the edges of their prey's territory. He turned his head slightly, tracking the movement. A row of motorcycles cruised down the street, moving past the hospital without stopping, but slowing just enough for the riders to take a good, long look. They weren't drunk, they weren't shouting or causing a scene, they were making their presence known. Frank met their stares, his face unreadable. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a thick beard, smirked as they passed. He tipped an imaginary hat toward Frank before rolling on. Frank didn't move until the last set of taillights disappeared. Then, without a word, he turned and walked toward his truck. It was time to gather the few. Cole was waiting at the old machine shop, the doors locked but the lights on inside. Frank knocked twice, and a second later the door swung open. Inside, Cole had already started gathering supplies, tools, radios, maps of the town, spread across a dusty work table. How bad? Cole asked. Frank grabbed a chair, sat down and rubbed his face. Bad. Cole nodded. Figures. Leland? Frank just shook his head. Yeah, Cole muttered. Should have guessed. A chair scraped across the floor, and Frank turned to see Sarah entering from the back room. She had changed out of her scrubs, wearing jeans and a jacket now, her expression hard. I'm in, she said. Frank raised an eyebrow. You sure? She crossed her arms. I lost my husband in Afghanistan. I know what happens when good people do nothing. Cole grinned. Well, that makes 3 of us, Frank sighed. Not enough. Cole smirked, pulling out his phone. Give it a minute. Frank didn't have to ask. Within the next half hour, 4 more men showed up. David Morales, a former Army Ranger who had spent the last few years working security at the lumberyard. Ethan Greaves, a retired cop who had quit the force after getting sick of Leland's corruption. Ben Carter, Sarah's older brother, a construction foreman built like a brick wall. And finally, Mason O'Rourke, a former Marine sniper who had been living off the grid for the past decade, only emerging when things got bad enough to need his attention. They all sat around the work table, quiet but determined. Frank looked at each of them, then exhaled. We're outnumbered, outgunned. No backup coming, he said, and they're coming for the hospital next. No one spoke. Then Mason cracked his knuckles. So when do we start? A slow grin spread across Cole's face. Tonight. Frank nodded, gripping the edge of the table. They didn't have the numbers, but they had the right men, and sometimes that was enough. Frank Holloway didn't sleep that night. He sat on his porch, an old habit from years past, one leg stretched out, a coffee mug resting against his knee. He watched the road, listened to the wind, and waited. He'd learned long ago that patience won battles as much as firepower. By dawn, the town was still quiet. The streets lay untouched, but the silence was deceptive. The Iron Reapers were here, even if they hadn't struck yet. They were watching, waiting for the right moment to sink their claws into Fairpoint. The moment wouldn't come. Not if Frank had anything to say about it. At first light, he grabbed his keys and drove. The others would be waiting. Cole Dawson had already opened the machine shop when Frank arrived. The smell of oil and sawdust mixed with the sharp scent of burnt coffee. He was leaning over a work table, flipping through a notebook covered in scribbled notes, maps, and supply lists. Frank stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "How many?" Cole glanced up, rubbing a hand through his unshaven jaw. "Morales, Greaves, Carter, O'Rourke, you, me, and Sarah. That makes 7. Frank exhaled through his nose. 7 wasn't enough, but it would have to be. "Town's still quiet," Frank said. "They're waiting." Cole nodded. "Yeah, they're smart about it. Taking their time. No rush. We're the ones on the clock, not them." Frank pulled up a chair and sat across from him. He tapped his fingers on the table, and thinking. "What's the plan?" Cole smirked. "I was waiting for you to tell me." Frank sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "We don't have the numbers for a straight fight, and we sure as hell don't have the law on our side." Cole leaned back, arms crossed. "That's not news." Frank stared at the map spread across the table. The hospital, the memorial, the local VA office, everything the Reapers wanted to defile. His fingers traced the streets, marking their entry points. "We hold them off," Frank said finally. "We dig in, keep them from moving in too fast. We make it harder for them to feel safe here." Cole snorted. "That's a nice way of saying we start a war." Frank's eyes darkened. "It's only a war if we lose." The door creaked open. Sarah Carter stepped inside, carrying a thermos. Her hair was tied back, her face tired but determined. "Good," she said, shutting the door behind her. "You're both here." Frank looked up. "Something happen?" She nodded, setting the thermos on the table. "Hospital administrator finally admitted they got a threat." Cole sat forward. "When?" "Last night. Anonymous call. Said they'd pay the price for honoring killers." Frank's jaw clenched. He knew what that meant. Sarah continued, voice steady but cold. "They're scared. Talking about moving patients, shutting down services until things cool off." "They won't cool off," Frank said. "Not unless we stop them." Cole drummed his fingers on the table. "So what do we do?" Frank looked at them both. "We get ready." By noon, they were at the old quarry. Frank stood with the others, the sun beating down on their backs, the dry heat rolling in waves off the stone walls. This place had been abandoned for years, but it still held echoes of something old, something strong. It felt like the right place to do what needed doing. Greaves was the first to speak. "All right, we're here. Now what?" Frank glanced at the gear they'd hauled out, rifles, shotguns, a few sidearms. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "We train," Frank said. The others exchanged glances, but no one argued. They understood. If they weren't ready, people would die. They spent the next few hours running drills. Greaves and Morales ran the group through cover positions, moving between the quarry walls like they were clearing a hostile zone. O'Rourke set up a shooting range, testing their accuracy under pressure. Ben Carter and Sarah worked on medical responses, stopping bleeding, moving wounded fast. By evening, they were tired, sore, and sweating through their shirts. Frank stood before them as they caught their breath. "We don't win this with firepower," he said. "We win by being smarter, by using what we have." Morales wiped his brow. "We have anything else?" Frank's lips curled slightly. "We have the town." They all knew what that meant. This wasn't about them. It was about every person in Fairpoint who wanted to live in peace. It was about the old men at the hospital, the kids who played in the town square, the people who had built their lives here. They weren't going to let that be taken away. By nightfall, Frank was back home, sitting on his porch again. The stars were out, but the night felt heavier than usual. He could feel it, something stirring in the darkness, creeping toward the edges of town. The kind of tension a man who had been through war didn't ignore. Then he heard it. Engines. Not loud, not reckless. Controlled. Frank didn't move as the motorcycles rolled past his house. 5 of them, then 10. Not stopping, not speeding up, just letting him know they were there. He leaned back in his chair, watching them disappear down the road. It was starting, and soon there'd be no turning back. The air was thick with something Frank Holloway hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not uncertainty. It was the weight of knowing what was coming, the way a soldier could smell an ambush before it happened. He sat outside his house, his shotgun resting against the old wooden railing, listening. The town was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that meant something was about to happen. It started just after midnight. A distant roar of engines moving fast. Frank was already on his feet when he heard the first explosion. It wasn't a massive blast, not enough to bring a building down, but it was loud enough to rattle windows, loud enough to wake the whole damn town. He was in his truck before he even realized he was moving, tires skidding against the pavement as he tore through the empty streets. He saw the glow before he saw the fire. The police station was burning. Not completely engulfed, but the front door had been blasted open, flames licking at the wood, glass shattered across the street, smoke curled into the night sky. And for a moment, Frank thought maybe, just maybe, someone inside had fought back, but there was no movement, no sirens, no response. Because there was no one left to respond. The Iron Reapers had planned it well. Take out the last honest cops, scatter the rest. That way, when the real attack came, no one would be left to stand in their way. Frank killed the engine, stepping out onto the cracked pavement. The air smelled of burning wood, melted plastic, and gasoline. He could hear the fire crackling, hear the distant echoes of tires screeching as the bikers moved on to their next target. Then he saw the body. Deputy Calvin Rains, young, eager, still fresh to the job, shot twice in the chest, lying just outside the station, his gun still in his hand. He had tried to hold the line. Frank knelt beside him, pressing 2 fingers against his neck, even though he already knew. Cold. He exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. Another explosion, this time farther away. Frank didn't wait. He jumped back into his truck, tires screeching as he sped toward the sound. The hospital. Sarah Carter was already outside when he arrived. She had a pistol in her hand, her knuckles white around the grip, her chest rising and falling with sharp, measured breaths. Behind her, the hospital's windows had been shattered, graffiti sprayed across the front doors in thick black paint. Traitors. Frank stepped out of his truck. "Anyone hurt?" Sarah shook her head, but her eyes were burning. "They didn't go inside. Just wanted to send a message." Frank looked around. The Reapers were gone, but they had left their mark. Broken windows, trashed cars in the lot, the air still thick with the stench of burned rubber. The town was waking up now, lights flicking on in houses, voices murmuring in the distance. People were scared, and that was exactly what the Reapers wanted. Cole pulled up a moment later, his motorcycle growling to a stop beside them. He climbed off, eyes scanning the scene. "How bad?" Frank pointed toward the hospital. "Intimidation. They hit the police station first." Cole's jaw tightened. "Any casualties?" Frank hesitated for half a second. "Rains." Cole exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Damn it." Sarah stepped closer. "They're not done, are they?" Frank looked down the street, toward the town square, toward the places the Reapers hadn't touched yet. "No," he said quietly. "They're just getting started." By dawn, the town was different, not just because of the damage. It was in the way people moved, in the way they spoke. They weren't just scared, they were waiting, watching. Leland was nowhere to be found. No statement, no press conference. The man had likely skipped town the moment the fire started. That left Fairpoint on its own. Frank, Cole, Sarah, Morales, Greaves, Carter, and O'Rourke met at the machine shop. None of them had slept. "They're testing us," Frank said, "seeing how far they can push before someone pushes back." Greaves cracked his knuckles. "Then we push back." Cole leaned forward, arms resting on the table. "They're going to hit something else, probably tonight." Frank nodded. "We need to be ready." The plan came together fast. They weren't just going to wait for the Reapers to make their next move. They were going to set the battlefield on their own terms. Morales and Greaves took the west side of town, near the old train station where the bikers had been seen gathering. Carter and O'Rourke covered the south, where the industrial district was mostly abandoned, easy ground for the Reapers to regroup. Frank, Cole, and Sarah stayed near the hospital. It was the biggest target, and the most important one to protect. Night fell slow and heavy. Frank sat in his truck across the street, shotgun resting against the passenger seat. He could see the hospital entrance from here, could see the way the security lights flickered just slightly. He knew Sarah was inside, ready. Cole was on his bike a few blocks down, waiting. Then just past midnight the engines came. Frank didn't move, didn't reach for his gun yet, he just watched. They came in waves, 10, 15, 20, rolling in slow, circling like vultures. This time, they weren't just looking. They were here to finish what they started. One of the bikes peeled off. A man stepping off and approaching the hospital doors. Frank couldn't see his face well, but he could see what he was holding. A bat. Frank exhaled, reaching for his shotgun. Then, before the biker could take another step, a voice rang out. "That's far enough. Cole." Frank turned his head just as Cole walked into the street, his pistol in his hand but not raised. The biker turned to face him, the rest of the Reapers slowing, their engines rumbling low. The man with the bat grinned. "You must be Cole Dawson." Cole didn't smile. "You know my name, but I don't know yours." The biker tilted his head. "Rex Malone." Frank's fingers tightened on the shotgun. He knew that name, Rex the Butcher Malone, one of the worst of them. Rex smirked. "You got some fight in you, I'll give you that." He glanced toward the hospital. "But you're on the wrong side." Cole took another step forward. "No, you are." Silence. Then Rex grinned again, taking a step back toward his bike. "Not tonight." He climbed on, revving the engine. The others followed suit, rolling back into the night, but they weren't retreating. They were just giving them time to prepare for what was coming next. And Frank knew it was going to be worse, much worse. Frank Holloway woke before the sun, the weight of the night still clinging to his bones. The Iron Reapers had tested them, and now they knew what they were up against. Rex Malone and his gang weren't going to disappear. They'd be back, and when they returned, it wouldn't be for show. The next time, they'd come to break something, or someone. Frank moved through his morning routine, pouring black coffee into a chipped mug, staring out the kitchen window at the empty road beyond. His hands were steady, his breath slow. Years ago, before a mission, there was always that moment of quiet when everything felt suspended in the air, like the world was holding its breath before the chaos began. This was no different. The only question was whether Fairpoint would survive what was coming. He grabbed his jacket, slung his rifle strap over his shoulder, and stepped outside. The others were already gathering at the machine shop. Cole Dawson was securing a crate of supplies in the back of his truck, his expression sharp, focused. Sarah Carter was talking with Morales and Greaves near a stack of sandbags, her arms crossed as she nodded along to something Morales was saying. Carter and O'Rourke stood by the door, checking over weapons. They weren't a militia, they weren't cops, but they were the only thing standing between the Reapers and the town. Frank walked up to the group, his voice even. "We don't have long. If last night was a test, they'll be back soon. We need to be ready." Cole shut the truck's tailgate and turned to him. "We've been talking. We know they'll come after the hospital again, maybe some of the government buildings, but we can't spread too thin. We need to pick our ground." Frank nodded, scanning the map Greaves had laid out on the table. "They'll hit more than one place, try to stretch us out. We need to make sure we can hold what matters most." Sarah spoke up. "The hospital is non-negotiable. They want to make a statement, and that's where they'll do it. Carter gestured toward the western edge of town. They could try to take the train station again. It's abandoned, but if they set up shop there, it'll be harder to get them out. Frank traced his finger over the map, considering the possibilities. The town square is another target. It's symbolic. If they take that, they own the town. Cole exhaled sharply. We don't have enough people to guard all three. Frank's eyes darkened. Then we make it so they don't want the fight. The group fell silent. Greaves finally spoke. You're talking about setting traps. Frank nodded. We don't outnumber them. But we know the land better. We make them fight for every inch. Make them think twice before they try to push deeper. O'Rourke smirked. Sounds like my kind of fight. They spent the next several hours preparing. The hospital came first. Barricades went up along the main entrance, steel barriers reinforced with wooden pallets, anything that could slow a vehicle. The side doors were locked down, emergency exits rigged to create bottlenecks if the Reapers tried to breach them. Frank and Carter secured vantage points inside, making sure there were clear sightlines to the street. The town square was next. They couldn't fortify it completely, but they could make it harder to take. Morales and Greaves set up roadblocks, using old cars and concrete barriers to funnel traffic into choke points. They positioned cameras in hidden spots, anything that would give them an early warning. The train station was the last piece of the puzzle. It wasn't worth guarding outright, but Frank had something else in mind. With Carter and O'Rourke's help, they rigged several points around the old building with tripwires. Nothing deadly, just loud enough to let them know if someone was there. By the time they were done, the sun was setting. Frank stood outside the hospital, watching the last bit of light fade beyond the horizon. Sarah joined him, arms crossed. You think it'll be enough? Frank didn't answer right away. He could still hear the roar of engines from the night before, the way the Reapers had moved like they owned the town. They'll come, he said finally, and when they do, we'll be waiting. Sarah studied him for a moment. You ever get tired of this? Fighting? Frank exhaled, staring into the distance. It's all I know. She nodded, understanding. Well, let's make sure this fight counts. A sound in the distance made them both turn. Engines, closer this time. Frank reached for his rifle. Here we go. The first attack came just after midnight. The sound of motorcycles filled the air, louder than before, engines revving in challenge. Frank was already in position, crouched behind a barricade outside the hospital. Cole was somewhere near the square. The others were scattered in their assigned positions. Then headlights flared in the distance. Frank lifted his rifle, peering through the scope. 5 bikes rolled into the parking lot, slowing to a crawl. The riders didn't move right away. They just sat there, letting the rumble of their engines fill the space. Then one of them dismounted. Rex Malone, the butcher. He took a step forward, raising his hands like he came in peace. Come on out, Holloway. Frank stayed where he was. He knew better than to answer a snake's invitation. Malone smirked. No, all right. I'll talk anyway. He gestured toward the hospital. We could take this place any time we wanted. You know that, don't you? Frank remained still. Malone's grin widened. You're protecting ghosts, old man. Institutions that don't matter anymore. You should have walked away. Frank's voice was low, calm. You should have never come here. Malone's smile vanished. Last chance, Holloway. Get out of our way. Frank leveled his rifle. I think you already know my answer. The next second, chaos erupted. The bikers revved their engines, roaring forward. A Molotov cocktail flew through the air, shattering against the pavement, flames licking at the ground. Gunfire cracked in the distance. Cole and the others holding the square. Frank fired. The first shot slammed into the lead rider's front tire, sending the bike skidding. The rider hit the ground hard, rolling into a stop. The others split, moving to flank the barricades. Sarah ducked behind cover, returning fire with controlled bursts. They're coming from both sides. Frank gritted his teeth, scanning the lot. He spotted Malone moving back, watching the chaos from a distance. This wasn't the full attack. This was just the beginning. Malone turned, climbing back onto his bike. He met Frank's gaze one last time before revving the engine and speeding off into the night. Frank's stomach twisted. They weren't retreating, they were regrouping. And the next time, they'd be coming with everything they had. The fire burned low in the hospital parking lot, the remnants of the Molotov cocktail still smoldering on the cracked pavement. The Reapers were gone, for now, but Frank Holloway knew better than to think they had given up. This was the prelude, the opening move of a war that had been waiting to happen. The real storm was still coming. He stood near the barricades, rifle slung over his shoulder, watching the darkness where the bikers had disappeared. The night air was thick, the silence almost suffocating. Sarah Carter was beside him, arms crossed, her breath slow and measured. "They'll come back," she said. Frank nodded. "Yeah." Cole Dawson approached from the side, wiping sweat from his forehead. He had been near the town square when the first attack hit, holding his ground with Greaves and Morales. He looked tired but ready. "They tested us," he said. "They wanted to see how we'd respond." Frank kept his eyes on the road. "And now they know." Cole exhaled through his nose. "So, what's the next move?" Frank glanced at him, then at the others who had gathered. O'Rourke, Carter, the rest of them. These weren't young men. They weren't fresh recruits looking for a fight. They were survivors, men and women who had already lived through their share of war, and now they were about to face another. "We dig in," Frank said. "We make sure that when they come back they regret it." The first few hours passed in tense silence. Frank and the others reinforced the barricades, checking every line of defense, making sure there were no weak points. They moved quickly, efficiently, using what little time they had left. The hospital was locked down, with Sarah overseeing the final security measures inside. The town square was fortified, roadblocks set up to slow down any approaching vehicles. Frank worked with Cole near the front line, setting up fallback positions behind the main barriers. He didn't like the way the night felt, the way the air carried that weight he remembered from too many battlefields. They weren't just defending a town. They were defending what it stood for. As they finished securing their positions, the first sound of engines cut through the stillness, a low rumble, distant but growing. Frank straightened, adjusting his grip on his rifle. He glanced at Cole, who met his gaze with a knowing look. This was it, the first wave. The sound grew louder, spreading across the town like a rolling thunder. Then the headlights appeared, glowing orbs cutting through the night. One bike, then another, then more, until the entire road seemed to pulse with the approaching storm. Frank took a deep breath. They were here. The Reapers didn't charge in recklessly. They moved with intent, spreading out as they reached the barricades. Frank counted at least 20, maybe more, their silhouettes shifting in the dim light. Then a voice called out, "Frank Holloway!" Rex Malone. Frank's grip tightened on his rifle. "Come on out, old man," Malone continued. "Let's talk." Frank didn't move. He had no intention of playing whatever game Malone was setting up. The bikers remained still, engines idling. The tension stretched, every second feeling heavier than the last. Then, without warning, the first shot rang out. A bullet slammed into the barricade, sending splinters flying. Frank didn't hesitate. He ducked low, leveling his rifle, scanning for the shooter. The night erupted into chaos. Engines roared as the bikers surged forward, tires screeching against the pavement. Another shot cracked through the air, this one hitting metal. The Reapers weren't just here to intimidate, they were here to take ground. Frank fired. His shot hit the front tire of one of the incoming bikes, sending it skidding. The rider lost control, crashing hard against the barricade. Cole was next, his pistol flashing in the darkness. He took down another, forcing the rest to slow their advance. Then the Molotovs came. Flames burst to life as bottles shattered against the barricades. Smoke rose into the night, thick and acrid. Frank kept firing, forcing the Reapers to stay back. Sarah was behind him, moving between cover, calling out positions. Morales and Greaves were holding the side flank, their shots controlled, precise. It wasn't a battle, it was survival. Frank saw movement near the edge of the fight. A biker breaking off from the main assault, slipping toward the hospital entrance. His stomach clenched. That was the real goal. He turned, taking off toward the entrance. "Sarah, watch the front!" She was already moving, pistol in hand, cutting across the lot. Frank reached the steps just as the biker did. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, a Reaper emblem stitched across his back. He had a crowbar in one hand, his other reaching for the door handle. Frank didn't hesitate. He slammed his rifle stock into the biker's ribs, sending him stumbling. The man recovered fast, swinging the crowbar in a wide arc. Frank dodged, barely missing the impact. The biker came again. This time Frank caught his wrist, twisting hard. The crowbar clattered to the ground. The man cursed, trying to wrench free, but Frank drove a knee into his stomach, sending him to the pavement. Sarah was there a second later, gun raised. "Don't move!" The biker groaned but stayed down. Frank turned back to the fight. The Reapers were pulling back, engines growling as they retreated. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. They were just falling back to regroup. Frank exhaled slowly, wiping sweat from his brow. They had won the first wave, but the real fight was still coming. The silence after the fight was the worst part, the kind of silence that crawled inside a man's head and made him think too much. The smoke still hung in the air, the smell of burning gasoline thick in Frank Holloway's lungs. The hospital doors had been secured, the barricades still stood, and the Reapers had pulled back. But that didn't mean the war was over. Frank stood outside, his rifle slung over his shoulder, eyes scanning the empty streets. They had taken down a few of the bikers, scared the rest off for now, but Rex Malone wasn't done. That much was certain. He'd be back, and next time he wouldn't be testing them. He'd be finishing what he started. Cole Dawson limped up beside him, wincing as he rolled his shoulder. "We bought some time," he muttered. "Not much, but some." Frank nodded. "They'll regroup. Try again." Cole exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "We need numbers, Frank. I don't care how many traps we set. 7 of us against 30 of them isn't gonna hold forever." Frank knew he was right. They were holding on by a thread, stretched thin, waiting for something to break. Sarah Carter stepped outside, tucking her pistol into her belt. "No serious injuries inside," she said. "Some broken glass, a few scared patients, but we got lucky." Frank looked at her. "Luck runs out." She held his gaze. "Then we make sure we don't need it." Before Frank could respond, Morales jogged up from the barricades, his expression dark. "We got a problem." Frank's gut clenched. "What is it?" Morales glanced between them, jaw tight. "Sheriff's office." Frank's eyes narrowed. "What about it?" Morales hesitated. "I just heard something on the scanner. Leland's been talking to them." The world around Frank went still. Cole straightened. "What do you mean, talking to them?" Morales exhaled through his nose. "He's been feeding them intel, giving them blueprints, security details. He's in deep with the Reapers." Frank felt his stomach turn. Leland had never been a good cop. He had always been the kind of man who did the bare minimum, who let things slide when it suited him. But this was worse. Frank clenched his jaw. "Where is he now?" Morales shook his head. "Didn't say, but I'll bet my last dollar he's not far." Cole ran a hand over his face. "Jesus Christ!" Frank didn't hesitate. He turned, heading straight for his truck. Cole called after him. "Frank, hold up." Frank didn't stop. He was done waiting. The sheriff's office was quiet when Frank pulled up. The burned-out front door still stood open, the inside dark, abandoned. The whole place smelled of smoke and cheap whiskey. Frank stepped out of his truck, boots crunching against the pavement, his pulse steady, controlled. Leland was inside. Frank could feel it. He pushed the door open the rest of the way, stepping into the dim light. The place was a mess, papers scattered across the floor, chairs overturned. Then he heard it, the distinct sound of a gun cocking. Frank didn't flinch. From the back of the room, Sheriff Dwayne Leland stepped forward, his revolver hanging loosely in one hand. His uniform was wrinkled, his face coated in sweat. He looked like a man who knew he'd run out of options. "Well," Leland said, his voice hoarse, "guess you figured it out." Frank didn't move. "How long?" Leland smirked, though there was no humor in it. Long enough. Frank studied him, his fingers twitching near his belt. Why? Leland let out a breath, shaking his head. You don't get it, Frank. You never did. This town's dead. Has been for a long time. And when men like Malone come knocking, you don't fight them. You deal with them. Frank's voice was cold. You call this a deal? Leland's fingers tightened around the revolver. You think you're the hero here? You're not. You're just an old soldier trying to fight a war that's already lost. Frank took a step closer. Leland's gun twitched. Frank's voice dropped. You sold out your own people. Leland swallowed. You don't understand. Frank cut him off. No, I understand perfectly. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of something inevitable. Then, before Leland could react, Frank moved. A sharp step forward, his hand striking Leland's wrist, twisting the revolver away. Leland stumbled back, letting out a strangled curse, but Frank didn't give him time to recover. He slammed the sheriff against the desk, wrenching the gun from his grip. Leland gasped, struggling, but Frank pinned him there, his grip unyielding. You gave them everything, Frank said, his voice dangerously low. Blueprints, security details. You sent them straight to the hospital. Leland didn't answer. Frank pressed harder. You killed Rains. Leland's breath came in short gasps. I didn't... Frank wasn't listening anymore. He pulled Leland up, shoving him toward the door. You're done. Leland stumbled, nearly falling. Frank, walk. The sheriff hesitated. Then, finally, he moved, stepping out into the night, hands raised. Cole, Morales, and the others were waiting outside. Cole's expression darkened when he saw Leland. Son of a bitch! Leland let out a bitter laugh. What now? You gonna lock me up? There's no one left to do the paperwork. Frank didn't answer. He pulled his gun and fired. The shot hit just inches from Leland's foot, kicking up dust. The sheriff jumped back, cursing. Jesus Christ! Frank leveled his gaze. Next time I don't miss. Leland swallowed hard. Cole stepped forward, shaking his head. You're leaving, Leland, tonight. If you're still here when the sun comes up, I'll be the one pulling the trigger. Leland looked at each of them, then exhaled sharply. He knew this was the end. Without another word, he turned and walked away. Frank didn't watch him go. Instead, he turned to Cole. We need to move, he said. The Reapers won't wait. Cole nodded. What's the plan? Frank's voice was steady. We finish this. The storm hit just after midnight. Frank Holloway had been expecting it. He had spent the last few hours reinforcing their defenses, checking every barricade, making sure the hospital doors were locked tight. The hospital was their last true stronghold, the place they couldn't afford to lose. They had fortified it as best they could, blocking off the main roads, securing the emergency exits, stationing men at every possible entry point. It wasn't perfect, but it was what they had. He had just finished double-checking the perimeter when the first gunshot cracked through the air. Then another. Then everything erupted at once. Engines roared, tires screeched, and the night exploded into chaos. The Reapers didn't hesitate this time. They came in fast, pushing straight through the first barricade on the north end, their motorcycles tearing over the pavement like a stampede of wild animals. The sound of gunfire filled the air, the rapid pop of pistols mixing with the heavier blasts of shotguns. Frank was already moving. He ducked behind a concrete barrier near the front entrance, his rifle pressed against his shoulder, eyes scanning the darkness. The Reapers had split into groups, some heading toward the hospital's main doors, others circling around the side. Sarah Carter's voice came through the radio. They're at the east entrance, trying to break through. Frank turned toward the side of the building. A group of bikers had taken cover near a parked truck, one of them raising a crowbar to smash a side window. Before he could finish, a single shot rang out. The man crumpled, his weapon clattering to the pavement. Frank exhaled. O'Rourke. The former sniper was stationed on the hospital roof, his rifle cutting through the darkness like a scalpel. But even with that advantage, they were outnumbered. More shots. A sudden burst of light as a Molotov cocktail smashed against the pavement near the entrance. Flames licked at the barricades, casting flickering shadows against the walls. Then came the second wave. A truck roared down the street, engine growling as it picked up speed. Frank's stomach dropped. They were going to ram the entrance. "Cole!" he barked into the radio. "Incoming vehicle! Front entrance!" Cole Dawson was already moving. Frank saw him sprint from his position near the side entrance, shotgun raised. The truck was seconds away from impact when Cole fired. The first shot hit the windshield, cracking the glass. The second hit the tire, causing the truck to swerve at the last second. It slammed into a barricade, metal crunching against concrete. But it didn't stop. The force of the impact sent the barrier skidding, knocking over a section of their defenses. The walls were collapsing. Frank pushed forward, ducking behind the remains of the barricade, firing at the bikers who had spilled out of the truck. They were moving fast, already regrouping, using the wreckage as cover. Sarah's voice crackled through the radio again. "We're losing ground on the east side." Frank turned his head. Through the smoke and chaos, he saw what she meant. A group of Reapers had broken through the side entrance, forcing their way into the building. He could hear shouting, the clatter of overturned equipment. His blood turned cold. They were inside. Frank moved fast, his boots pounding against the hospital floor. The hallways were dimly lit, shadows stretching long against the walls. He could hear them, heavy boots, voices barking orders, the sound of something crashing to the ground. He raised his rifle, pressing himself against the wall as he neared the corner. Then a figure emerged. Frank fired. The biker went down, his body hitting the floor hard. Another one came around the corner, swinging a crowbar. Frank ducked, the metal scraping against the wall just inches from his head. He drove his shoulder into the man's chest, knocking him off balance before slamming the butt of his rifle into his face. The biker crumpled. Frank turned the corner, moving toward the sounds of struggle. Sarah was there, crouched behind an overturned desk, gun in hand. "They're trying to get to the patients," she said, breathless. Frank nodded, gripping his rifle tighter, not on his watch. They pushed forward together, moving down the hallway. More gunshots, more shouts. Frank fired twice, dropping another biker before he could reach the hospital rooms. Then he saw her. One of the nurses, a young woman in scrubs, cornered by a Reaper with a knife. Frank didn't think, he just moved. The biker turned just in time to see Frank's rifle barrel aimed at his chest. Frank pulled the trigger. The man dropped. The nurse let out a sharp breath, her hands shaking as she stared down at the body. Frank placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now." She nodded, exhaling shakily, before hurrying toward the secured rooms. Frank turned back to Sarah. "We need to clear them out." She nodded. "Let's finish this." The fight lasted another 20 minutes, but by the end of it, the hospital was secure. The remaining Reapers had either fled or been taken down. The side entrance was reinforced, the fires outside extinguished, but the damage was done. 2 of their men were injured, the barricades were weakened, and worst of all, the town was breaking. Frank stood outside, watching as the last of the Reapers disappeared into the night. His muscles ached, his head pounded, but he forced himself to stay upright. Cole walked up beside him, his face grim. "They'll be back." Frank nodded. "I know." Sarah approached, wiping blood from her forehead. "How long do we have?" Frank's jaw clenched. Not long enough. They had survived the night, but the war was far from over. The morning after the battle felt like the calm after an explosion, unnaturally still, the weight of what had happened pressing down on everything. Smoke still lingered in the air, the scent of burnt rubber and gasoline mixing with the damp chill that always came with dawn. The hospital stood, battered but not broken. The barricades were half destroyed, the front entrance scorched, but they had held, for now. Frank Holloway moved through the wreckage, his boots crunching over glass and debris. The bodies had already been cleared, the wounded treated as best as they could be with what little supplies they had left. Morales was crouched near what was left of the northern barricade, rolling his stiff shoulder as he checked the damage. Greaves was up on the hospital roof, scanning the roads through his scope, watching for movement. They all knew it was only a matter of time before the Reapers returned. Sarah Carter was at Frank's side, arms crossed, her face tight with exhaustion. "We barely held them off," she said, her voice low. Frank nodded, scanning the ruined street. "Next time, they won't give us breathing room." Cole Dawson approached, tossing a half-burned cigarette to the ground and grinding it under his boot. His jacket was torn, dried blood on his knuckles. "O'Rourke's watching the square. Says there's been movement near the train station." Frank's jaw tightened. "They're regrouping." Cole exhaled sharply. "Yeah, and there's more of them now." Frank didn't flinch. He had expected this. The Reapers wouldn't take a loss lightly, and Rex Malone wasn't the kind of man to accept humiliation. He would come back, and when he did, he wouldn't be playing games anymore. The sun had barely crested the horizon when the sound of approaching engines echoed through the town. Not a full attack. Not yet. Frank watched as 3 bikes rolled into view, moving slow, deliberate, a warning, a message. The lead rider was a familiar figure, broad-shouldered, thick beard streaked with grey. Rex, the Butcher Malone. Frank felt the tension roll through the group as the Reapers slowed to a stop just outside the barricades. The other 2 bikers stayed on their bikes, their hands resting near the holsters at their sides. Malone dismounted, adjusting his gloves as he took a step forward. His lips curled into something that might have been a grin if there had been any humor in his eyes. Frank stepped forward, keeping his rifle slung but ready. Cole and Sarah flanked him, standing firm. Malone took his time, looking around, taking in the damage, the broken barricades, the bullet holes, the burn marks. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Hell of a mess you made here, Holloway." Frank didn't blink. "Seemed necessary." Malone chuckled. "Oh, I bet it did." He shifted his stance, rolling his shoulders. "You put up a good fight. Gotta say, I wasn't expecting that." Frank remained silent, letting Malone talk. The Reaper leader's expression darkened. "But I'm done playing. I'm done with warnings. This town, it belongs to us now. You and your people had your chance to step aside. You didn't, so now it's gonna cost you." Frank's fingers flexed slightly at his sides. "You got a real bad habit of underestimating people." Malone smirked. "Nah, I just like giving people options." He motioned behind him toward the town. "I've got 50 men on standby, ready to roll in the second I give the word. We're talking full occupation, no more hit and run, no more messages. We're talking blood." Cole's jaw tightened. "Then why the hell are you standing here talking?" Malone's grin widened. "Because I'm feeling generous." He met Frank's gaze, his expression turning cold. "You surrender the hospital. Let my boys in. Let us do what we came to do. In return, I let the patients go. I let your people walk away." Frank's breath came slow and steady. He knew exactly what this was. Malone was a butcher, in name and in practice. Surrendering meant letting them inside, letting them do whatever they wanted. It meant giving up the town, giving up everything they had fought for. And he knew Malone was lying. Even if they surrendered, there would be no walking away. Frank didn't need to turn to his people to know what their answer was. His voice was calm, firm. "No deal." Malone's grin faltered. His nostrils flared slightly. "Think real hard about this, Holloway." "I already have." Silence stretched between them. Malone exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Damn shame." He turned, walking back toward his bike. "You got till nightfall." He swung his leg over the seat, pausing only to glance back at Frank. "After that, we burn it all down." Then they were gone, rolling back toward the train station. The moment they disappeared, Sarah let out a breath. That was a death sentence. Frank nodded. "Yeah." Cole clenched his fists, staring down the road. "So what now?" Frank looked at him. "We make sure this town doesn't fall." The others knew what that meant. It was time to make a final stand. The day moved too fast. They spent the remaining hours reinforcing everything they could. Morales and Greaves worked on the barricades, using whatever they could scavenge to replace the ones that had been damaged. Sarah and Carter gathered the civilians who had stayed, making sure they were safe, arming those who were willing to fight. Cole and O'Rourke focused on the weapons. Ammunition was low. They had enough for a fight, but not enough for a war. Frank moved between them all, checking, double-checking, making sure everything was ready. He found Sarah near the hospital entrance, reloading her pistol. She looked up as he approached. "You think we make it through this?" Frank was quiet for a moment. "I don't know." Sarah nodded slowly. "But we fight anyway." "Yeah." The sun dipped lower. Then finally it was gone, and the night belonged to the Reapers. The first explosion shattered the silence. A fireball erupted near the town square, sending debris flying. Engines roared, headlights flared, and the full force of the Iron Reapers came crashing down. Frank raised his rifle. "Hold the line!" And then the war truly began. The fire from the first explosion was still burning when the second blast hit. This one was closer, shaking the ground beneath Frank Holloway's feet. The night had erupted into chaos. Engines roared, gunfire cracked through the air, and the Iron Reapers were flooding into town like a storm breaking over the land. Frank crouched behind a concrete barrier near the hospital entrance, rifle pressed against his shoulder, scanning for movement. The first wave of bikers had already breached the outer defenses, using the confusion of the explosions to break through. A truck had smashed through one of the barricades near the square, its tires still spinning in the dirt. Sarah Carter's voice crackled through the radio. "They're coming in from the east, 3, maybe 4 of them near the emergency entrance." "Hold them off," Frank ordered. Sarah's response was drowned out by another round of gunfire. Frank swung his rifle toward the road. A group of bikers had taken cover behind a parked car, one of them reloading a shotgun. Frank exhaled slowly, then fired. His shot hit the biker's shoulder, knocking him back against the hood of the car. The others ducked lower, returning fire blindly. Cole Dawson sprinted across the lot, sliding behind an overturned dumpster. "They're pushing hard," he shouted. "More of them coming up near the side entrance." Frank glanced toward the hospital. The building was holding, but barely. The barricades were still up, but they wouldn't last much longer. Then he saw movement near the fire escape. 2 Reapers climbing, moving fast, trying to get in through the second floor. Frank didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the fire escape, raising his rifle. The first biker had just reached the landing when Frank fired. The bullet slammed into his side, sending him sprawling. The second one froze, his hands tightening on the railing. Frank fired again. The second biker crumpled, his body hitting the metal steps hard. Cole appeared beside him, panting. "That won't be the last of them." Frank nodded, his breathing steady. "We need to end this before they overrun us." Cole wiped sweat from his forehead. "You got a plan?" Frank exhaled sharply. "Yeah, but you're not gonna like it." They regrouped inside the hospital, moving fast through the dimly lit halls. The remaining defenders were spread thin, fighting to hold every entrance. Sarah was securing the stairwells with Carter and Morales, while Greaves and O'Rourke were covering the rooftop. Frank pulled out the map of the building, spreading it across the counter in the hospital's makeshift command center. "We don't have the numbers to hold out forever," he said, "so we make them come to us." Cole frowned. "What do you mean?" Frank tapped a section of the basement. "We rig the lower levels, turn it into a trap." Sarah's eyes widened. "You want to blow up the hospital?" "Not the whole hospital," Frank corrected. "Just enough to bury them." Morales shook his head. "We barely have enough explosives left to hold the barricades." Frank's jaw tightened. "We don't need a full collapse, just enough to cut off their reinforcements." Cole stared at the map. "You're talking about bringing the fight underground." Frank nodded. "We pull back, make them think we're losing ground. Then, when they push into the lower levels, we bring it down on them." Sarah exhaled sharply. "That's a hell of a gamble." Frank met her gaze. "We're out of options." She didn't argue. The setup took less than an hour. They rigged the basement support columns with what little explosives they had left. It wouldn't be a massive detonation, but it would be enough to collapse part of the lower level, cutting off access to the upper floors. Frank moved quickly, checking each charge, making sure everything was set. He had done things like this before, long ago, in a different war. The process was familiar, even if the stakes were different. Cole watched him work, arms crossed. "You're planning to stay behind, aren't you?" Frank didn't look up. "Somebody has to set it off manually." Cole clenched his jaw. "Damn it, Frank." Frank straightened, meeting his gaze. "This isn't up for discussion." Cole's hands curled into fists. "You're not dying in this basement." Frank's voice was steady. "If it means stopping them, I will." A tense silence stretched between them. Then Sarah's voice came through the radio. "They're breaking through." Frank grabbed his rifle. "Then let's give them what they want." The final battle started like a flood. The Reapers surged through the hospital's lower levels, pushing past barricades, forcing the defenders back. Frank led the retreat, moving through the halls, directing everyone toward the upper floors. Gunfire echoed through the corridors, the walls shaking with every impact. Morales was hit, a bullet grazing his arm, but he kept moving. Carter dragged him up the stairs, Greaves covering their retreat. Frank stayed near the rear, firing controlled shots, slowing the bikers down. Then he heard it. Malone's voice. "Come on, Holloway, you don't have to die down here." Frank didn't respond. He just kept moving. The defenders reached the upper floors. The moment they were clear, Frank turned toward the explosives. He took one last breath, then he pressed the detonator. The explosion was deafening. The ground trembled, the walls shaking as the lower level caved in. Dust and smoke filled the air, debris crashing down in a cascade of stone and steel. The shockwave rattled the entire building, sending tremors through the floors. Then finally, silence. Frank coughed, pushing himself up from where he had fallen. The basement was gone, buried under tons of rubble. The Reapers were trapped. He exhaled slowly, gripping his rifle. It was over. The survivors gathered outside as the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon. The hospital still stood, battered but unbroken. Cole walked up beside Frank, his face unreadable. "You made it," Frank smirked. "Almost didn't." Sarah joined them, looking back at the ruined entrance. "And the Reapers?" Frank's expression hardened. "Buried." Cole let out a breath, shaking his head. "Jesus." Frank nodded slowly. "It's done." But in the back of his mind, he knew. Malone wasn't dead, and the fight wasn't over. Smoke still rose from the ruins of the hospital's lower levels, the thick scent of dust and gunpowder clinging to the early morning air. The town was quiet, but it wasn't peace. But it was the kind of silence that came when both sides were reloading, licking their wounds, waiting for the next shot to be fired. Frank Holloway stood at the barricades, gripping his rifle, watching the horizon. The sun had barely started creeping up, its weak light casting long shadows over the battered streets of Fairpoint. The Iron Reapers hadn't attacked again, not yet, but Frank knew they would. They had been hurt, maybe even more than they expected. But men like Rex Malone didn't retreat. They regrouped, they learned, and then they came back, meaner, more desperate, and twice as dangerous. Cole Dawson stepped up beside him, rubbing a hand over his face. "No movement yet," he said, "but it's coming." Frank nodded. "Yeah." Sarah Carter walked up, her expression tight. "I just checked in with the hospital staff. We're running out of supplies. If this goes on much longer, we won't be able to keep treating the wounded." Frank exhaled through his nose. "Then we end it tonight." Cole frowned. "You got a plan?" Frank turned, scanning what was left of their defenses. The barricades were still holding, but barely. They had lost too much ground, burned through too much ammo. If the Reapers pushed hard enough, they'd break through. But that wasn't the real problem. Frank knew Malone. The man wasn't just looking to win. He wanted to make a statement. He wanted to show that Fairpoint couldn't fight back. And that meant he wasn't just going to send his men in to shoot it out. He was going to burn the town to the ground. Frank looked at the others. "We don't have enough to hold them off forever, but we don't have to." Cole crossed his arms. "What are you thinking?" Frank's gaze was steady. "We make them come to us. We force them into a kill box, and we finish this." The plan took shape quickly. Morales and Greaves would hold the hospital entrance, making sure the wounded stayed protected. Sarah and Carter would help reinforce the barricades, setting up a fallback position in case things went bad. Frank, Cole, and O'Rourke would take the fight to the Reapers. They knew where Malone was hiding out. The train station had been his base since the beginning, a place where the Reapers could regroup, patch themselves up and plan their next move. It was the heart of their operation, and Frank was about to rip it out. By nightfall, they were ready. Frank crouched behind the ruins of an old gas station, eyes locked on the train station in the distance. The Reapers had fortified it, blocking off the roads, posting men at every entrance. Cole was next to him, checking his magazine. "You sure about this?" Frank didn't answer. He didn't need to be sure. He just needed to get it done. O'Rourke's voice came through the radio. 2 on the roof, another 3 near the entrance. Frank tightened his grip on his rifle. "We go in quiet, take out as many as we can before they know what's happening." Cole smirked. "Just like the old days." Frank nodded once. Then they moved. The first guard never saw it coming. O'Rourke took him down with a single suppressed shot, his body crumpling against the pavement. Frank and Cole moved fast, slipping through the shadows, sticking to the cover of rusted-out train cars. The second guard barely had time to turn before Frank's knife found his throat. They were inside before the others even knew they were under attack. Then the shooting started. Cole kicked open the side door, shotgun booming as he took down the first Reaper in sight. Frank fired twice, dropping another. Then the alarms went up, shouts filled the air, boots pounding against the floor. The Reapers scrambled to respond, their surprise giving Frank and the others a few precious seconds to take better positions. Malone's voice rang out, "They're inside, kill them!" The fight turned brutal. Frank moved through the station like a ghost, every shot controlled, every movement precise. Cole covered his flank, O'Rourke firing from the rafters, taking down anyone who got too close. Then, from the back of the station, a door slammed open, and there he was, Rex Malone. His face was twisted in rage, his leather jacket splattered with blood. He held a shotgun in one hand, a knife in the other. And he was smiling. "You should have stayed dead, Holloway." Frank raised his rifle. Malone fired first. Frank barely dodged in time, the blast shredding the wooden beam behind him. He hit the ground hard, rolling to the side as Malone charged. Cole fired, but Malone was fast, ducking behind a stack of crates before the shot could land. Then he was on Frank, swinging the knife in a wide arc. Frank blocked it, his forearm catching the blade, pain slicing through his skin. He gritted his teeth, driving his knee into Malone's ribs. The Reaper leader grunted, stumbling back. Frank didn't give him time to recover. He tackled him, both men crashing against the floor. The shotgun clattered away, the knife lost in the chaos. It was just fists now. Malone landed the first hit, his knuckles smashing against Frank's jaw. Stars burst in Frank's vision, but he pushed through the pain, driving his elbow into Malone's face. They rolled, trading blows, neither willing to give an inch. Then Malone's hands found Frank's throat. He squeezed, his teeth bared, his eyes wild. Frank struggled, his vision darkening. Then he reached out, his fingers brushing against something cold and heavy. His rifle. With the last of his strength he grabbed it, swinging it upward, smashing the stock into Malone's head. The Reaper leader fell back, dazed. Frank coughed, sucking in air, then leveled his rifle. Malone blinked up at him, blood dripping from his temple. He started to laugh. "Go on, old man." "Do it!" Frank's finger tightened on the trigger. Then he exhaled and lowered the gun. Malone frowned. "What?" Frank slammed the butt of the rifle into his face. Malone went limp. Cole walked up, panting. "He dead?" Frank shook his head. "Not yet." O'Rourke's voice came through the radio. "We got incoming. More bikes!" Frank turned to Cole. "Time to go!" They dragged Malone to his feet, hauling him outside. The rest of the Reapers were in full retreat, their leadership broken, their will shattered. But Frank knew it wasn't over. Not yet, because sometimes the real war didn't end with gunfire. It ended with what came next. Frank Holloway could barely feel his legs as he dragged Rex Malone across the ruined train station lot. The Reaper leader was bleeding badly from the gash on his forehead. Barely conscious, his weight shifting limply against Frank's grip. The air was thick with the smell of burnt rubber and blood, gunpowder still lingering in the breeze. Behind them, Cole Dawson was covering their escape, his pistol still smoking from the last few shots fired at the retreating bikers. "Keep moving," Cole shouted, voice strained. "They'll regroup fast." Frank didn't need the warning. He could hear it already, the distant roar of more engines, the echo of chaos reverberating through the town like a second heartbeat. The Reapers weren't done. They were just wounded, angry, and more dangerous than ever. They reached the waiting truck, and Frank shoved Malone into the back. The biker groaned, his eyes rolling back as his head lolled against the seat. Sarah Carter was already behind the wheel, her hands tight on the steering wheel, her knuckles white. "We don't have time for this," she snapped, her eyes flicking toward the horizon. "They're coming." Cole slammed the truck's tailgate shut and jumped into the passenger seat. "We taking him back to the hospital?" Frank shook his head, climbing into the bed of the truck, bracing himself against the metal as Sarah floored the gas pedal. The tires screeched against the asphalt, and the truck lurched forward, speeding down the main road toward the outskirts of town. "No," Frank finally answered, his voice steady despite the chaos. "The hospital isn't safe. We need to take this fight somewhere else." Cole twisted in his seat, frowning. "Where?" Frank didn't hesitate. "The quarry." Sarah didn't argue. She yanked the wheel, sending the truck skidding onto the dirt road leading out of town. The wind whipped against Frank's face as he watched the buildings shrink behind them, the hospital's broken windows glinting in the moonlight. He could see the flames still smoldering in the distance, could hear the faint echoes of sirens and gunfire. Fairpoint was barely standing, and he wasn't sure how much more it could take. The old quarry sat on the edge of town, a vast pit of jagged rock and crumbling ledges, abandoned for years. The entrance was flanked by rusted-out machinery, forgotten remnants of when men used to carve stone from the earth. Now it was just another graveyard, a fitting place for the Reapers to die. Sarah killed the engine, and the truck skidded to a stop on the gravel. Frank jumped out first, yanking the door open and hauling Malone from the seat. The biker groaned, but he wasn't in any shape to fight back. Frank dragged him toward the edge of the quarry, forcing him onto his knees. Cole was right behind him. "This your plan?" he asked, breathing hard. "Bring him out here and wait for his boys to show up?" Frank didn't look at him. His eyes stayed locked on Malone. "No, my plan is to end this." Malone let out a weak, gurgling laugh, spitting blood onto the gravel. "You think this is over?" Frank crouched down, gripping the man's collar, forcing him to look him in the eyes. "Your men are done, Malone. They're fighting out of desperation now. You know it. I know it." Malone smirked, even through the pain. "Maybe, but desperate men are the ones you should fear the most." The sound of approaching engines cut through the night. Frank released Malone, standing slowly as the first wave of headlights appeared on the dirt road leading to the quarry. Dust kicked up in thick clouds, the thunder of motorcycles growing louder, closing in. Cole stepped up beside him, his pistol clenched tight. "Well, they found us." Sarah pulled her rifle from the truck. "How many?" Frank squinted into the distance, counting. "Too many." Cole exhaled sharply. "So, what's the play?" Frank's fingers tightened around his rifle. "We hold them off long enough to bury them." The first shots rang out before the Reapers even reached the quarry. Frank fired first, taking out the lead rider's front tire. The bike skidded violently, sending its rider tumbling into the dirt. Cole was next, dropping another with a clean shot to the shoulder, sending him spinning off course. But there were still too many. Bikes roared into the quarry, their riders dismounting fast, weapons drawn. Bullets whizzed through the air, striking rock, kicking up dust. Frank ducked behind a rusted-out bulldozer, breathing hard, scanning for openings. Sarah was taking cover behind the truck, returning fire in short, precise bursts. Cole reloaded quickly, cursing under his breath. "We're boxed in." Frank glanced toward the edge of the quarry. The drop was steep, the rocks jagged, and the explosives were still in the truck bed. His mind worked fast, calculating. He reached into the truck, yanking open the crate of explosives they had salvaged. Cole saw what he was doing. Frank didn't look at him. "Get back to town. Hold the line." Cole's face hardened. No. Frank grabbed his collar, pulling him close. That's an order. Cole stared at him, breathing hard. He saw it in Frank's eyes. There was no talking him out of this. Frank shoved him towards Sarah. Get moving. Sarah hesitated, shaking her head. Frank, go. She swallowed hard, then grabbed Cole's arm, dragging him back toward the truck. Frank turned back to the battle, lifting one of the charges in his hands. Malone was still on his knees, watching him with a bloody grin. You're a stubborn bastard. Frank exhaled. Yeah. Then he pulled the pin. The explosion rocked the quarry. The shockwave sent bikers tumbling, fire and rock erupting from the impact. The ground beneath them cracked and gave way, the ledge collapsing in on itself. Frank barely had time to react before he was falling. He hit hard, rolling over jagged stone, pain flashing white-hot through his ribs. The world spun. The sound of crumbling rock filled his ears, and then silence. Frank groaned, pushing himself up. Everything hurt. Blood dripped down his arm. His head pounded. Above him, he could hear shouting, the sound of bikes retreating, and then nothing. He had done it. He had ended it. The Reapers were gone, or buried. His body ached, but he managed to roll onto his back, staring up at the stars. For the first time in a long time, he let himself close his eyes. Maybe, just maybe, this was enough. And if it wasn't, well, he'd done his part. The dust hadn't settled yet when Cole Dawson reached the edge of the quarry. His boots skidded against the loose gravel, lungs burning as he searched the wreckage below. The blast had torn through the cliffside, sending a cloud of debris into the night. The ground was uneven, split in places where the rocks had collapsed in on themselves. "Frank!" Cole shouted, his voice hoarse. No answer. Sarah Carter ran up beside him, panting, gripping her rifle like it was the only thing keeping her steady. Her face was pale in the moonlight, streaked with dirt and sweat. "Do you see him?" Cole scanned the rubble below. There was wreckage everywhere, shattered bikes, twisted bodies, broken rock. Some of the Reapers had survived, but they weren't fighting anymore. Those who could still walk were dragging themselves away, disappearing into the night. The rest were buried. But Frank Holloway was nowhere to be seen. Cole cursed under his breath. He was right at the edge when it went off. He could be under. Sarah was already moving, sliding down the slope before he could stop her. "Damn it, Sarah!" She didn't listen. She picked her way through the wreckage, pushing aside broken pieces of metal. Searching, her hands shaking. Cole followed, his heart hammering. The dust made it hard to breathe, the smell of burnt fuel thick in the air. Then he saw it, a dark shape, half buried under a slab of stone. Sarah gasped. "Frank!" Cole dropped beside her, hands moving fast, pulling away the loose debris. Digging through the rubble, Frank wasn't moving. His face was covered in dust, his shirt torn, blood soaking into the fabric. His right leg was trapped beneath the rock. Cole grabbed his shoulder. "Frank!" Nothing. Sarah pressed her fingers against Frank's neck. A second passed, then another, then she let out a breath. "He's alive!" Cole felt his own breath come back to him, his vision steadying. But there was no time to celebrate. The dust wasn't just settling, it was rising again. In the distance, the faint sound of engines echoed through the canyon. The Reapers that had survived were regrouping. Cole gritted his teeth. "We need to move." Sarah nodded, and together they worked fast, shifting the rubble, freeing Frank's leg. He let out a low groan but didn't wake. His breathing was shallow, his body limp. Cole lifted him, grunting at the weight. "Come on, old man. You don't get to go out like this." They climbed as fast as they could, hauling Frank back toward the waiting truck. The sound of approaching engines grew louder. Sarah jumped into the driver's seat, starting the engine with a roar. Cole pulled Frank into the back, gripping his rifle as he scanned the road behind them. Then he saw them, the last of the Reapers, 6 or 7 of them, closing in. "Go!" Cole shouted. Sarah slammed her foot down, the truck lurching forward. The tires kicked up dust as they tore down the dirt road, leaving the quarry behind. Gunfire rang out. Bullets pinged off the metal of the truck. Cole fired back, his shots controlled, forcing the bikers to swerve. Sarah gritted her teeth, knuckles white on the wheel. "They're not letting up." Cole checked his magazine. Almost empty. Then ahead, he saw the town and the barricades. O'Rourke was waiting, standing on the roof of the gas station, rifle raised. The second they crossed into town, O'Rourke fired. The first biker went down instantly. The others hesitated. That was all they needed. The truck skidded to a stop near the hospital. Cole jumped out, dragging Frank with him. Morales and Carter rushed forward. "Get him inside." Sarah ran ahead, pushing open the doors. "We need a stretcher." The nurses scrambled, clearing a path as Cole and Morales carried Frank inside. They set him down on the closest gurney. Frank groaned, his eyelids fluttering. Sarah leaned over him. "Stay with us." Frank's eyes cracked open slightly. His voice was weak, barely audible. "Did we win?" Cole let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah, Frank, we won." Frank exhaled, then slipped back into unconsciousness. Sarah looked at Cole. "We need to stabilize him." Cole nodded, stepping back as the nurses moved in. He turned to Morales and Carter. "How bad is it out there?" Carter wiped sweat from his brow. "The Reapers are done. The ones that made it out are either running or surrendering." Morales nodded. "Fairpoint's still standing." Cole took a slow breath, letting the words settle. It was over. The next morning the town felt different. The streets were quiet, but not in the way they had been before. This wasn't fear. It was something else, something lighter. People were coming out of their homes, stepping past the broken barricades, looking at what remained. Shopkeepers swept away glass. Families moved debris. The town square, once the heart of Fairpoint, was damaged but not destroyed. They had survived. Frank Holloway was still unconscious, but the doctor said he would make it. Sarah had stayed by his side all night, refusing to leave the hospital. Cole had spent the morning walking through town, checking in on the people who had fought, the ones who had stayed. By midday, a crowd had gathered outside the hospital, the people of Fairpoint, the survivors. Cole stood on the steps, looking over them, feeling the weight of everything they had lost, everything they had fought for. Then, from the back of the crowd, someone started clapping. It spread slowly, rippling through the people, growing louder. Not a celebration, not a victory cry. It was respect for Frank, for everyone who had stood their ground. Cole swallowed hard, nodding once. Then he turned and walked inside, heading back to Frank's room. The old man was still asleep, his breathing steady. Sarah was sitting beside him, arms crossed. "He'd hate all the attention," Cole muttered. Sarah smirked. "Yeah, he would." Cole exhaled. "But he deserves it." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Frank stirred. His eyes opened slowly, focusing on Cole. His voice was rough but steady. "You better not be standing around while there's work to do." Cole grinned. "Welcome back, old man." Frank blinked, his lips twitching into the faintest of smirks. Outside, the town of Fairpoint was waking up, and for the first time in a long time, there was hope. Frank Holloway wasn't used to hospitals. He had spent his life patching up wounds in the field, treating injuries with whatever was available, and walking away from most of his own with nothing but stitches and a whiskey chaser. Being confined to a bed, wired up to machines that beeped at him like a goddamn metronome, was worse than any battlefield. He had tried to get up twice. Sarah Carter had stopped him the first time. The second time, Cole Dawson had threatened to strap him down. Frank had sworn at him, but the truth was, he didn't have the strength to fight. Not yet. The town was still standing, the Reapers were gone, and for now, that was enough. But something was different. Frank could feel it before he even opened his eyes that morning. The air was thick with something else, something heavier than gunpowder, something deeper than exhaustion. He could hear voices outside his room, hushed but urgent, people moving, the weight of something looming over the town. Then the door creaked open and Cole stepped inside. Frank turned his head slightly. "You look like hell." Cole smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Funny, I was about to say the same about you." Frank exhaled slowly, shifting against the stiff mattress. "What's going on?" Cole hesitated, then pulled a chair closer. His movements were slower than usual, like he was carrying something heavy. Frank frowned. Spit it out. Cole rubbed a hand over his face. It's all over the news, Frank. What happened here? The fight. The Reapers. You. Frank's brow furrowed. So? Cole let out a breath, shaking his head. So, people are talking, not just people here, everywhere. Frank's stomach twisted. He didn't want this. He had fought for Fairpoint, for the people who lived here, not for some damn headline. I don't need a damn parade, he muttered. Cole gave him a look. It's not about what you need, Frank. It's about what you did. You fought for this town when no one else would. You held the line when the law turned its back. People don't just forget that. Frank sighed, looking away. Outside, he could hear more movement, more voices. Then Sarah stepped into the room. There's something else. Frank glanced at her. Christ, what now? Sarah's expression was unreadable. You have visitors. Before Frank could protest, the door swung open again, and two men in dark suits stepped inside. Frank knew before they even introduced themselves. Government men, military, but not active duty, probably from the Department of Veterans Affairs, maybe something higher. The older of the two, a tall man with grey at his temples, extended a hand. Mr. Holloway. Frank didn't move. The man let his hand drop. My name is Major Tompkins. This is Agent Keller. We're here on behalf of the government. Frank's grip on the blanket tightened. And what for? Tompkins' gaze was steady. Your story's gone national. What you did here, it matters. Frank scowled. It matters to Fairpoint, that's all. Tompkins exchanged a look with Keller before continuing. People see you as a symbol now, Mr. Holloway, a reminder of what this country was built on. Strength, honor, sacrifice. Frank exhaled sharply. I didn't do this for a damn speech. We know, Keller said. That's why it matters. Frank felt something cold settle in his gut. What do you want? Tompkins straightened. The president wants to meet you. The words hung in the air like a gunshot. Cole let out a slow whistle. Well, shit. Frank's jaw clenched. He turned to Sarah. You knew about this. She nodded. The call came in this morning. It's real, Frank. Frank shook his head. I don't have time for this. I've got a town to help rebuild. Tompkins didn't flinch. That's exactly why you should go. People need to see that there are still men like you out there. Men who stand their ground, who fight for what's right. Frank stared at him, his mind running through every reason to say no. Then he thought about the people outside, the ones who had lost homes, the ones who had stayed to fight because they had nowhere else to go. Maybe it wasn't about him. Maybe it was about them. Frank exhaled. When? The trip to Washington was a blur. Frank had barely been out of the hospital for 2 days when they loaded him onto a private jet, his ribs still sore, his legs still stiff from the injury he had taken at the quarry. The press was already circling like vultures, cameras flashing as soon as he stepped onto the tarmac. Cole was right beside him, keeping them at bay with his usual gruff demeanor. Sarah was there too, though she had made it clear she was only coming to make sure Frank didn't say something that would get him arrested. The moment they landed in D.C., they were met by a military escort. Men in dress uniforms saluted him as he stepped off the plane, and Frank felt the weight of it pressing down on his shoulders. He didn't want this, but it wasn't about what he wanted. The White House was overwhelming, too clean, too polished. The kind of place that felt like a different world compared to the dirt and blood of Fairpoint. They led him through security, through halls lined with history, and then finally into a quiet room where the President of the United States was waiting. The man stood as Frank entered, extending a hand. Mr. Holloway. Frank hesitated, then shook it. Please, the President said, motioning toward a chair. Sit. Frank did. The President studied him for a long moment. I've read the reports, I've seen the footage, what you did in Fairpoint. He paused, choosing his words carefully. It reminds us of what this country is supposed to be. Frank shifted. I didn't do it for recognition. The President nodded. That's why you're here. Frank glanced around the room. So what now? The President leaned forward. We want to honor you. Medals, ceremonies, a speech, if you're up for it. Frank exhaled. And if I say no? The president's lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. Then we shake hands, you go home, and you keep doing what you do. Frank looked at the floor for a long moment. Then he met the president's gaze. I'll go home. The president nodded. I thought you might say that. They shook hands again. And just like that, it was over. When Frank got back to Fairpoint, the town was waiting. Not with parades, not with speeches, but with respect. People lined the streets as he stepped out of the truck, nodding, shaking his hand, clapping him on the back. There were no cameras, no press, just the people who had fought beside him. Cole stood beside him, arms crossed. Hell of a trip, huh? Frank smirked. Let's never do that again. Sarah chuckled. Agreed. Frank took a deep breath, looking around. The town was still broken, still scarred, but it was alive, and maybe that was enough. For now. Frank Holloway sat on his porch, a cigarette burning low between his fingers, the smoke curling into the evening air. He wasn't much of a smoker, not anymore, but tonight felt like the kind of night that called for old habits. The town was quiet now, not in the way it had been when danger loomed, but in the way a town should be, peaceful. It had been a week since Washington. A week since he had shaken the president's hand, since he had turned down medals and speeches, since he had stepped back onto Fairpoint's dirt roads and remembered why he had fought in the first place. He didn't need awards. This town, these people, was all that mattered. The screen door creaked open behind him. Frank didn't need to look to know it was Cole Dawson. The man had spent more time at Frank's house than his own lately. Cole stepped onto the porch, crossing his arms. They still calling? Frank exhaled smoke, shaking his head. Not as much. Cole smirked. Guess they finally got the message. Frank flicked the cigarette into the dirt. Doubt it. Cole leaned against the railing. Town's rebuilding, faster than I thought it would. Frank nodded. People are tougher than they look. Cole studied him for a moment. And you? Frank didn't answer right away. He had spent his whole life fighting, first in Vietnam, then in the shadows of his own mind, and now, finally, here. Fairpoint had been the last fight, the last stand, but something about it lingered. Cole sighed. You look like a man who doesn't know what to do with himself. Frank chuckled dryly. That obvious? Cole smirked. You ain't exactly subtle. Frank leaned back, staring at the darkening sky. Spent my whole damn life moving from one war to the next. Now there's no war left. Cole nodded slowly. Maybe that's a good thing. Frank wasn't sure. He had never been the kind of man who sat still. Even now, with the Reapers gone, with Fairpoint safe, something inside him felt restless, like an old machine that had been running too long to shut down. Before Cole could say anything else, the sound of an approaching car broke the quiet. Both men turned as a black SUV rolled to a stop in front of the house. Cole frowned. More government suits? Frank sighed. Guess we're about to find out. The doors opened, and a woman stepped out. Early 40s, blonde hair pulled back tight, wearing a dark jacket that might as well have been a uniform. She moved with purpose, like someone who had spent her life giving orders. Frank stood as she approached, waiting. The woman stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. Mr. Holloway. Frank crossed his arms. Who's asking? She pulled a badge from her pocket, flipping it open. Captain Elena Marks, United States Army. Cole raised an eyebrow. Army? Thought they were done with him. Marks ignored him, her eyes locked on Frank. Mind if we talk inside? Frank hesitated, then nodded. Cole followed them in, shutting the door behind them. Marks glanced around the small living room, taking in the old furniture, the rifle mounted above the fireplace, the books stacked in neat piles. She turned back to Frank. You did something in Fairpoint that most people wouldn't have dared. Frank shrugged. Did what needed doing. Marks nodded. That's exactly why I'm here. Frank exhaled. Spit it out. Marks didn't hesitate. The country's changing, Mr. Holloway. The way things are moving. Fairpoint won't be the last town to face something like this. Frank narrowed his eyes. What are you getting at? Marks folded her arms. We need men like you. Frank let out a short, humorless laugh. I'm retired. Mark smirked. You were retired before Fairpoint too. Cole sat on the edge of the couch, watching. You asking him to go back in uniform? Mark shook her head. Nothing like that. No chains, no bureaucracy. We're putting together something different. A rapid response unit. People who know how to fight, how to stand their ground when no one else will. People like you. Frank stayed quiet. Marks continued. You wouldn't be alone. Dawson, Carter, even O'Rourke if he's interested. We need fighters, not just soldiers, leaders. Cole leaned back. And what? We just go where you tell us? Marks met Frank's gaze. You go where you're needed. Silence stretched. Then, finally, Frank sighed. I've done enough fighting? Marks nodded, like she had expected that answer. I won't press you. But think about this. Fairpoint was lucky. They had you. The next town might not be. Frank exhaled slowly. Marks pulled a card from her pocket, setting it on the table. When you change your mind, call me. Then she turned and walked out. Cole picked up the card, turning it over. Think you'll change your mind? Frank didn't answer. He was still staring at the door long after she was gone. The days passed, and the town kept rebuilding. Sarah Carter returned to her work at the hospital, overseeing the repairs, making sure the wounded were taken care of. Cole helped where he could, fixing up buildings, reinforcing what was left of the barricades just in case. The people of Fairpoint had been through hell, but they weren't broken. Neither was Frank. But he felt different. Something inside him had shifted. The fight had been won, but the battle wasn't over. He could feel it in his bones. One evening, he found himself staring at the card Marks had left. He hadn't called, hadn't even touched it, until now. He picked it up, weighing it in his fingers. Then, without thinking, he flipped open his old flip phone and dialed. The line rang once, twice. Then Marks's voice came through. I was wondering when I'd hear from you. Frank took a slow breath. I'm in. Frank Holloway had made up his mind, but he wasn't rushing into anything. He spent the next few days watching Fairpoint put itself back together, walking the streets, talking to the people who had fought to keep their town. It wasn't just about the buildings being rebuilt, though there was plenty of that. Hammering, welding, painting over the scars left behind by the reapers. It was about the people. They were stronger now, more aware. They had stood against something meant to break them, and they hadn't just survived, they had won. Cole Dawson was at his usual spot outside Miller's general store when Frank found him, his boots kicked up on the porch railing, a cup of coffee balanced on his knee. The two of them hadn't talked much since the meeting with Captain Marks. Frank had needed time to think, and Cole had given him space. But now it was time to say it. I'm going, Frank said, settling into the chair beside him. Cole sipped his coffee, nodding. Figured. Frank raised an eyebrow. That easy? Cole smirked. You're not the kind of man who sits still, Frank, and after everything we just went through, I don't think either of us are built for waiting around to see what happens next. Frank nodded, staring out at the quiet street. Fairpoint's safe now. For now, Cole said. But Marks is right. This won't be the last time a town like this gets tested. Frank exhaled slowly. You in? Cole tilted his head, considering. Then he grinned. Somebody's got to watch your back. Frank chuckled. Guess that means we'll need to tell Sarah. Cole's smirk faded. She ain't gonna like it. No, she wouldn't. Frank had known that from the second he made his decision. Sarah Carter had fought just as hard as the rest of them, but her battles had always been different. She had been the one patching them up, keeping them alive, making sure the town didn't collapse under the weight of what had happened. She had earned the right to be angry. Frank found her at the hospital, overseeing the last of the repair work. She was in the middle of talking to one of the contractors when she saw him coming. The moment their eyes met, she knew. She sighed. Tell me you're not doing what I think you're doing. Frank stopped a few feet from her, arms crossed. I have to. Sarah shook her head. No, you don't. The fight's over, Frank. For Fairpoint, he said. But what about the next town? She stared at him, jaw tight. And what happens when you don't come back? Frank didn't answer. Sarah exhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair. Damn it, Frank, you nearly died. We all nearly died. I know. And you still want to throw yourself into another fight? Frank held her gaze. It's not about wanting to. It's about knowing I have to. Sarah let out a bitter laugh. And what? I'm just supposed to accept that? Let you ride off to fight some new war? Frank's voice softened. I need you to understand. Sarah crossed her arms, her frustration evident, but after a long moment she sighed. I knew this was coming. The second Mark showed up. I knew. Frank nodded. It's who we are. Sarah looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then finally she said, just don't get yourself killed. Holloway. No promises, Frank said, a hint of a smirk on his lips. The last night before they left, Fairpoint gathered at the town square. It wasn't a send-off, not exactly, but people knew. Word had spread that Frank and Cole were heading out, and even if no one said it outright, it was clear what was happening. O'Rourke was there, arms crossed, his usual scowl in place. Damn shame. Thought I was finally rid of you two, Frank smirked. You'll miss us, O'Rourke grunted. Not likely. Morales and Carter showed up a few minutes later. Morales clapped Cole on the back. Guess I'll have to hold down the bar without you. Cole grinned. Think you can handle it? Not a chance, Morales said, laughing. Carter shook Frank's hand. You're doing the right thing. Frank nodded. I hope so. Sarah was the last to arrive. She didn't say anything at first, just stood beside Frank as they watched the people of Fairpoint talking, laughing, moving on. She finally spoke. You really think you can make a difference out there? Frank considered that. I don't know, but I have to try. Sarah nodded slowly. Then go. Frank glanced at her. You sure? She smirked. No, but I know you, Frank, and you don't belong in one place for too long. Frank exhaled. Looking around one last time, Fairpoint had survived. It would continue to survive, and now it was time to take what they had learned here and carry it forward. Cole clapped him on the shoulder. Ready? Frank looked at the town, at the people who had fought with him, at the place that had become something worth protecting. Then he nodded. Yeah, let's go. They left before sunrise, the sky still dark, the road stretching ahead of them. Frank didn't know what was waiting for them out there, but whatever it was, he was ready. The road stretched endlessly before them, a black ribbon cutting through the pale morning mist. Frank Holloway drove in silence, hands firm on the wheel, his eyes locked on the horizon. Cole Dawson sat in the passenger seat, his arms crossed, watching the empty landscape roll by. Neither of them spoke much. There wasn't anything left to say. They had left Fairpoint behind. It wasn't an easy thing to do, but it had been necessary. The town would be fine, stronger than before. Sarah would keep the hospital running. Morales and Carter would make sure no trouble crept back in. O'Rourke would stay on his rooftop, keeping watch, even if he pretended not to care. Frank had done his part. Now it was time to do more. Cole finally broke the silence. Where are we headed? Frank didn't look away from the road. Marks has a staging point in Texas. She wants us there in 2 days. Cole nodded, then smirked. Hope she's got better coffee than Fairpoint. Frank huffed a quiet laugh. Doubt it. They drove for hours, stopping only for gas and food. Frank had spent so many years on the road, moving from one place to the next, that it felt almost natural to be out here again. The hum of the engine, the wind whipping past the open windows, it reminded him of a time before Fairpoint, before the Reapers, before everything. But things were different now. This time he wasn't running. They hit the Texas border by nightfall. The sky was a deep shade of blue, stars flickering above the empty highway. Cole had dozed off in the passenger seat, his hat pulled low over his face. Frank kept driving, the soft glow of the dashboard lights illuminating his weathered hands. A radio sat on the dashboard, crackling with occasional static. Marks had given it to them before they left, a direct line to her people. Frank hadn't touched it yet. He wasn't ready to hear whatever orders were waiting for them. He pulled into a gas station just outside Amarillo, the neon lights buzzing overhead. Cole stirred as the truck rolled to a stop. We there? He mumbled. Frank shut off the engine. Not yet. Cole stretched, rubbing his eyes. You ever gonna tell me why you really signed up for this? Frank leaned back against the seat, staring out at the empty lot. A lone trucker was fueling up a few pumps away. The world felt quiet here, isolated. He finally spoke. "I spent my whole life fighting wars, thought I was done. Then Fairpoint happened." Cole nodded slowly. "And now?" Frank exhaled. "Now I figure I've got a little more fight left in me." Cole grinned. "Well, let's hope we're fighting the right people this time." Frank glanced at the radio. "Guess we'll find out." They reached the staging point the next afternoon. It wasn't a military base, not officially, but it sure as hell felt like one. Tucked away in the hills outside Austin, the facility was a repurposed airstrip, surrounded by chain-link fences and watchtowers. Men and women moved with purpose, their movements precise, controlled. This wasn't some ragtag operation. Marks had built something real. Frank and Cole stepped out of the truck, scanning the compound. Marks was waiting for them near the entrance, her arms crossed. "Took you long enough," Cole smirked. "Sorry, got caught up admiring the scenery." Marks didn't smile. "You're late." Frank ignored the jab. "We're here now." Marks nodded. "Follow me." They walked through the compound, past rows of armored vehicles, weapons racks, and supply crates stacked high. The people here weren't active-duty military, but they weren't amateurs either. Private security, ex-soldiers, cops who had seen too much and walked away. People like Frank. Marks led them into a briefing room where a large map was pinned to the wall. Red circles marked key locations, small towns, border checkpoints, supply routes. Marks turned to them. "We're building a network. You two just walked into something bigger than Fairpoint." Cole crossed his arms. "So what exactly are we doing?" Marks pointed at the map. "There are other towns like yours, other places that have been left behind. Criminal organizations, extremists, corrupt law enforcement. You name it, it's out there, and it's growing." Frank studied the map. "So we stop it." Marks met his gaze. "That's the idea." Cole let out a low whistle. "And here I thought we were just going to be riding around, drinking bad coffee." Marks didn't react. "You want out, this is your chance. But if you're in, you're in." Frank didn't hesitate. "I'm in." Cole glanced at him, then exhaled. "Guess that makes two of us." Marks nodded. "Good. You start tomorrow." Frank lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of his small bunk. The sounds of the compound hummed around him, distant conversations, the occasional roar of an engine, the metallic clatter of weapons being checked and rechecked. This wasn't home, but it wasn't Fairpoint. Either. It was something new, something necessary. Frank closed his eyes. Tomorrow, the fight started again. Frank Holloway had been through more missions than he could count, but this one felt different. It wasn't an ambush in the jungle or a firefight in the streets of Fairpoint. This was something quieter, something heavier. He stood at the edge of a cemetery just outside Austin, the early morning sun casting long shadows across the rows of white headstones. The funeral was small, private, just the way the fallen man would have wanted it. Rex Malone was dead, not by Frank's hand, not in a blaze of glory. The butcher had bled out in a holding cell 3 days after being captured, his body too broken to fight anymore. The official report said organ failure, but Frank knew better. Malone had died the moment he realized his empire was gone, his men scattered, his war lost. Even knowing that, Frank had come, not to mourn, not to celebrate, to close the book. Cole Dawson was beside him, hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket. He let out a low whistle. "Hell of a thing, huh?" Frank didn't answer. He just stared at the casket being lowered into the ground, a simple wooden box with no family to claim it. Sarah Carter had told him not to come. "He doesn't deserve a funeral," she had said, the anger still fresh in her voice. Maybe she was right. But Frank had learned a long time ago that burying the dead wasn't about what they deserved. It was about the living. Cole shifted beside him. "Never thought I'd see the day." Frank exhaled slowly. "Men like him don't last forever," Cole smirked. "Neither do we." Frank's lips twitched slightly. "Guess we'll find out." They stood in silence as the grave diggers finished their work. There were no speeches, no eulogies. Just the wind moving through the trees, the sound of dirt falling onto wood. And then it was over. Frank turned away first, walking back toward the waiting truck. Cole followed, his boots crunching over the gravel. As they climbed inside, Cole glanced at him. "So, what now?" Frank started the engine, staring out at the road ahead. "There's always another fight." They returned to the compound that night. The briefing room was filled with maps, dossiers, photos pinned to corkboards. Marks was waiting for them, her arms crossed as they stepped inside. "Malone's dead," she said matter-of-factly. Frank nodded. "I know." Marks motioned toward the wall. "That doesn't mean the job's done." Frank followed her gaze. The map was covered in red circles, names scrawled in ink, criminal organizations, corrupt officials, the kind of people who thought they could do whatever they wanted. Marks pointed to a location in New Mexico. "We've got intel on a militia group that's been making noise. Nothing big yet, but they're getting bolder. We need to shut them down before they turn into another Reapers," Cole smirked. "And here, I thought we'd get a break." Marks didn't react. "You two leave in the morning." Frank studied the map. Another town, another fight. He looked at Cole. "Better get some sleep." Cole chuckled. "Like hell I will." Frank let out a slow breath, then turned back to Marks. "We'll take care of it." Marks nodded. "I know." Frank left the briefing room, stepping out into the cool night air. The compound was quiet, the hum of distant engines the only sound. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the old lighter he had carried since Vietnam. He flicked it open, watching the flame dance for a moment before snapping it shut. Fairpoint had been the beginning, but it was far from the end. Frank Holloway still had work to do, and he wasn't done yet. Frank Holloway stood at the edge of the desert highway, staring out at the horizon. The sun was setting, bathing the sky in deep reds and oranges, stretching long shadows across the cracked asphalt. Wind kicked up dust along the roadside, and somewhere in the distance, the low hum of an approaching storm rolled across the land. It had been months since Fairpoint. Months since he and Cole Dawson had walked away from the town they had fought to protect. Since then, they had traveled from one fight to the next, shutting down militias, dismantling criminal networks, cutting off the rot before it could spread. Frank hadn't planned on doing this forever, but now he wasn't sure what forever even meant anymore. The old truck idled beside him, its engine ticking softly as it cooled. Cole leaned against the hood, arms crossed, watching Frank with that same knowing smirk he always had. "You thinking about calling it quits?" Frank didn't answer right away. He exhaled slowly, the warm desert air filling his lungs. "You ever get tired?" he asked finally. Cole chuckled, shaking his head. "Every damn day, but we both know you ain't walking away." Frank ran a hand over his stubbled jaw, watching the sky darken. Maybe Cole was right. Maybe men like them didn't get to stop. A motorcycle rumbled up the road, its lone rider slowing as he approached. The man climbed off, dusting himself off, nodding toward them. He was younger, mid-30s maybe, with sharp eyes and a military stance that told Frank everything he needed to know. "Mark sent me," the rider said. "Got intel on a group stirring up trouble outside El Paso. Thought you boys might want in." Cole smirked. "Guess that answers that." Frank sighed, rolling his shoulders. The aches never really went away, but the moment he heard there was another fight, another town that needed saving, he felt something else stir inside him. Purpose. "Where's the meat?" he asked. The rider grinned. "Follow me." Frank looked at Cole. Cole clapped him on the back. "Let's go do some good, old man." Frank nodded, climbing into the truck. The engine growled as he pulled onto the road, following the bike as it disappeared into the distance. The fight never ended, but neither did men like Frank Holloway. And as long as there was a battle worth fighting, he'd be there. Some warriors never stopped. They just kept moving forward, into the next war, into the next fight, into the next sunrise.